Dunkirk, triumph or disaster? Was the Battle of Dunkirk a triumph for the British, or was it a complete disaster? And we're starting off, really, we're kind of going back, I suppose, to September 1939, and I've put a map down here of Europe in 1939. And when the war started, as I'm sure you know, it started because Germany invaded Poland, which is just here. So I'll just highlight that for you. Here's Germany, and they went into Poland this way on the 1st of September 1939. Now, if you look at the map there, I always think, who could stop them? Well, you know, obviously the biggest threat was the Soviet Union, but they actually signed a pact with the Soviet Union, and they partitioned Poland, they split it in half, and the Soviet Union got the east side of Poland. Then things kind of went quiet, apart from the fact that obviously Britain and France declared war on Germany at this point when they went into Poland. But then not a lot happened until April 1940, when Hitler launched a seaborne invasion of Norway and very quickly occupied Norway. The British troops had to sail back to Britain in retreat. Norway was left in the hands of Nazi Germany. In that same month, Churchill became Prime Minister in Britain, and Germany also launched an offensive this way towards Greece. So things were not looking too clever for Britain and France at this point, and the next step was obviously going to be for Germany to invade France itself. Britain therefore sent around 400,000 troops into France at this point to try and help the French to defend themselves against Germany. Germany knew this, and obviously the French had their Maginot Line over here, lots of fortifications to stop Germany from invading. Nevertheless, the invasion went ahead. Part of it was through the Ardennes Forest, which obviously the French thought was impassable. Part of the push was through Belgium. The British eventually, and the French, it was a disaster for them. And they ended up, you look at the map over here, in this corner, top corner of France, in retreat, and they were surrounded by two German armies who were pushing them into this corner at Dunkirk. And obviously there was a beach at Dunkirk where the greater part of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, were stranded. At this point, there were some decisions to make. One of them was to surrender, to avoid what seemed on the surface to be an annihilation. What was going to happen was going to be an annihilation. Option number two was a seaborne evacuation. This is exactly what Churchill and Bertram Ramsay, who's this gentleman here, decided on. And Bertram Ramsay was in charge of the Royal Navy at that time. Churchill and Ramsay both agreed that evacuating the troops out of Dunkirk was a feasible option. Obviously, they would need to commit the RAF to this as well, to give air cover. The reason I've put a picture of Hitler on there is that Hitler had a key part in the Battle of Dunkirk. On about the 27th of May, he ordered his panzer tanks to halt around the perimeter for a few days, and this allowed the evacuation of troops to begin. It allowed the British and I suppose the French to a certain extent to plan the evacuation, and this would have been a typical scene of that evacuation. The target that they actually set was to evacuate 50,000 troops from the beach. What they actually managed to achieve was an evacuation of 334,000 troops from the beach, which, you know, when you look at it that way, there's the target, there's the end result. You have to say it's a triumph and a success. However, that's not forgetting that actually there was a lot of equipment that was left behind. I'm just going to very quickly draw a little grid here. We're going to have disaster on this side. We're going to have triumph on this side. You know, you'd have to say, looking at this, our first point to say it's a triumph is that really, that 334,000 were evacuated. It allowed Britain to carry on the war as well. Without those troops, Britain would not have been able to carry on. However, the losses in equipment, so we are talking about tanks, we're talking about jeeps, we're talking about machine guns, all sorts of stuff, and of course rifles, were left behind, much of which could not really be replaced straight away, which left the British Army in a bit of a bind for quite a considerable amount of time. Obviously, the Americans were supplying weapons at that time, but even so, it was a big blow to lose that amount of equipment. Everything was left behind. Some rifles the soldiers managed to salvage, but most of the stuff was left. Of course, when we talk about disaster, yeah, 334,000 troops were saved, but also, one of the biggest things is that France was now occupied by Nazi Germany. And, this meant that the Germans could set up U-boat bases around France. I'll just go back to the map. So, for example, there was one on the south coast down here. There was one over here at Saint Nazaire. So, it meant that the Germans could do that. And for that reason, strategically, it was in some ways a disaster. Also, they could put the Luftwaffe, on the coast. And, of course, they could begin to plan potentially the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. Furthermore, they lost 60 planes and pilots. Sorry, it was pilots. I don't think planes, but they lost 60 pilots, RAF pilots, and these guys would have been incredibly valuable in the Battle of Britain that was to come. However, there's one thing we haven't mentioned yet, and I'm going to put it on the triumph side, and that is the Dunkirk Spirit, and I'll put it in marks, because, the Dunkirk Spirit is something that we still talk about today, and this was the psychological boost that was a result of this massive evacuation. The British people pulled together in a time of great desperation, if you like, and managed to pull off something that, seemed on the surface to be a triumph, and certainly the British media, portrayed it that way. And you have to remember that at this point, Nazi Germany seem invincible. They've gone through, as I say, Norway. They're attacking in Scandinavia, in the Low Countries, and it seems that they're sweeping every opponent aside. And the United States isn't interested at this point. Russia has signed a non-aggression pact with. I suppose the final point is that Churchill proved himself to be a decisive leader in this, and also Ramsay, and the Navy was intact, and the Navy had played a huge role in the evacuation. They did lose 6 battleships, which I'll kind of put over this side somewhere. They did lose 6 battleships, and that was a big loss. But on the other hand, Churchill and Ramsay had orchestrated this incredible evacuation of French and British troops. It also allowed the Free French Army to carry on the fight after the surrender of France. The Free French Army was established and fought in places such as North Africa. So in terms of just finishing off really on triumph or disaster, my conclusion is triumph. Dunkirk was a triumph. The Battle of France was a disaster. I mean, the tactics were archaic. The tactics were World War I tactics, and that's what led to defeat. But Dunkirk itself allowed Britain to carry on in World War II, and that has to be seen as the decisive factor that came out of it.